The night the sky over Houston turned orange. Noah Holt was 3 years old. He didn't understand fire. Not really. He understood the way it made the shadows on his bedroom ceiling twist and stretch into shapes that didn't belong there. He understood the way the air tasted sharp and wrong, the way his small chest tightened with every breath, like something invisible was sitting on it. He understood, in the wordless way that very young children sometimes do, that the world outside his door had become something entirely different from the world he had fallen asleep in. He sat up in bed and listened. The house was making sounds it had never made before. Deep, low groans from somewhere below. A crackling that reminded him of the fireplace his mother lit on cold evenings. Except this was louder, much louder, and it was everywhere. Then the smoke came under the door, thin at first, like a gray ribbon sliding across the floor toward him, and Noah did the only thing that made sense. He called for his mother. The door burst open before the sound had fully left his mouth. Lauren Holt was still in the clothes she'd been wearing that evening, which meant she hadn't slept. She crossed the room in 4 steps, moving through the thickening air with the kind of focused calm that only arrives when panic has been pushed completely aside by something stronger. She didn't speak right away. She lifted Noah from the bed, pressed him against her shoulder, and carried him toward the window at the far end of the hallway, the one that faced the side yard, the one closest to the ground. "I've got you," she said quietly. "I've got you, baby." The window opened with a hard shove. The night air rushed in cooler and cleaner, and Noah gulped it in while his mother worked quickly, knotting a bedsheet around the radiator pipe, with hands that didn't shake, even though they should have. She fed the makeshift line out the window, tested it once, then turned to him. "You're going to hold on, and I'm going to lower you down," she said, looking directly into his eyes. "When your feet touch the grass, you let go and you move away from the house. You don't stop. You don't look back. You just move. Mama, you can do this." Her voice was steady, certain, the voice of someone who had already decided how this was going to go. "I'll be right behind you." She lowered him slowly. His small fingers gripped the sheet, then the windowsill, then nothing. And for one long, stomach-dropping second, he was in the air, swinging slightly in the night breeze. Then his feet found the wet grass, his knees buckled, and he went down onto his palms in the cold dew. He scrambled upright and looked back up at the window. That was when he saw the man, not his mother, not the neighbors beginning to appear at the edges of their yards, in their night clothes, drawn by the glow. A man moving along the far side of the property, head angled down, cutting toward the street with long, deliberate strides. The kind of walk that doesn't belong to someone who has just noticed a fire and stopped to help. The kind of walk that belongs to someone leaving before anyone starts asking questions. The flames behind the downstairs windows threw unsteady light across the yard. Just enough. Noah saw his face clearly. The line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the way he didn't slow down, didn't flinch, didn't look back, even once, as the house behind him continued to burn. It lasted only a few seconds. The man moved quickly, and the darkness at the edge of the property swallowed him. But Noah was 3 years old, and his mind was wide open, and it locked onto that image, the way a photograph locks a moment in place forever. He stood on the wet grass and waited for his mother to appear at the window. She didn't come. The firefighters arrived with their trucks and their noise and their enormous gloved hands that lifted him off the ground and wrapped him in a rough blanket. Someone asked his name. Someone checked his eyes with a small light. Someone called him Buddy and Little Man and carried him toward the flashing vehicles at the end of the driveway. And all around him, there was movement and urgency, and the organized chaos of people doing their jobs. Nobody thought to ask what he had seen. At the hospital, in a room that smelled like antiseptic and recycled air, a nurse with tired eyes held his hand and told him he was safe. A doctor spoke in low, careful tones to a tall man in a dark coat just outside the door. Words drifted in smoke, inhalation severe, didn't suffer, so sorry for your loss. And Noah sat on the paper-covered bed and listened. and understood more than anyone in that room believed he could. He pulled at the nurse's sleeve. "There was a man," he said. "He ran away. I saw his face." The nurse smiled, the distracted smile of someone with 11 other things to manage. "You're okay, sweetheart. You're safe." "A man," he said again, more carefully, the way he'd heard grown-ups repeat things when they wanted to be taken seriously. "He ran before the trucks came." "Shh." She tucked the blanket more firmly around him. "You've been through so much tonight. Just rest now." He tried once more before he understood that trying wasn't going to change anything. Later, a hospital volunteer brought him a stuffed bear, brown soft, slightly scorched, at one ear, found on the grass near the side of the house. Noah took it without a word and held it against his chest and stared at the pale Houston sky beginning to show through the window as the night thinned toward morning. The news would call it an accident. The report would note no witnesses. The city would move on the way cities do, quickly, without looking back. He knew the name. He knew the face. But the world had already moved on without asking. And so, without anyone ever making the decision, for him Noah Holt went quiet. 4 years is a long time to wait for a child to speak. It is long enough to try everything. Every specialist, every therapy, every carefully worded approach, recommended by doctors who spoke in calm, measured tones and charged more per hour than most people earned in a week. It is long enough to watch hope shift slowly and without announcement into something quieter, something closer to acceptance. Though Raymond Holt would never have used that word. Acceptance implied surrender, and Raymond Holt did not surrender. He adapted. He restructured. He found workarounds the way he always had in business, in negotiations, in every situation where the outcome refused to cooperate with his expectations. He hired people. He created systems. He made the problem as much as any problem involving a 7-year-old child could be made manageable. What he could not do, what no amount of restructuring had ever managed to fix, was make his son look at him. The Holt estate sat on the western edge of Houston's most sought-after residential corridor, behind iron gates and a long driveway lined with trimmed hedges that a groundskeeping crew maintained twice a week. The house itself was the kind of place that appeared in architectural magazines. High ceilings, wide windows, every surface chosen with deliberate precision. It was a house built to impress, and it did. Every single person who walked through its front door commented on it. What they didn't comment on was the silence. Not the peaceful kind of silence that settles into a well-ordered home at the end of a long day. This was the other kind, the kind with weight to it, the kind that pressed against the walls and collected in corners and made guests unconsciously lower their own voices without knowing why. It was the silence of a house that had once held something warm and had not yet figured out how to fill the space that warmth had left behind. Raymond stood in the doorway of his son's room on a Tuesday morning, briefcase already in hand, car already waiting at the bottom of the driveway. Noah sat on the floor near the window legs, crossed back straight, exactly where he had been sitting when Raymond checked 20 minutes earlier. In front of him was a wooden train set, still in its original configuration. Not a single piece moved from where the housekeeper had arranged it 3 days ago. Beside it sat a collection of building blocks, a remote control car still in its box, and a basketball signed by a player whose name had cost Raymond a significant favor to obtain. Noah wasn't looking at any of it. He was looking out the window, one arm wrapped around the worn, stuffed bear he carried everywhere, the same one he'd had since the night everything changed, and his expression was the careful, distant expression of someone watching something very far away that no one else could see. Raymond's own doctor had a clinical term for what Noah experienced. Selective mutism rooted in acute trauma, the mind's way of drawing a boundary around something it couldn't process, protecting itself, the only way it knew how. Raymond had read every article, every study, every forum thread, written by parents navigating the same territory. He understood the condition academically completely. Understanding it had not brought him 1 inch closer to his son, I'll be home by 6, Raymond said. Noah didn't turn around. Mrs. Aldridge will have lunch ready at noon. A pause. The weather's supposed to clear up this afternoon. Maybe you could go outside for a bit. The silence held. Raymond looked at his son. For a moment longer. At the set of those small shoulders, at the way his fingers rested lightly on the bear's worn ear. And then he did what he had trained himself to do. He nodded at no one in particular, turned, and walked back down the hallway toward the stairs. Dominic Holt was waiting in the kitchen. Raymond's cousin and the chief financial officer of Holt Industries, a position he had held for the better part of a decade, was leaning against the marble countertop with a coffee mug in one hand and the easy, unhurried posture of a man entirely comfortable in spaces that belonged to other people. He was well-dressed in the understated way of someone who understood that wealth didn't need to announce itself. His smile when Raymond appeared was immediate and warm. "He's still not talking?" Dominic asked, nodding toward the ceiling, toward Noah's room above them. "No change," Raymond said, setting his briefcase on the counter and reaching for the coffee. Dominic made a sound, sympathetic, measured, the sound of a man who had expressed sympathy about this particular subject many times and had learned exactly how much to offer. "Ray," he said after a moment, "I heard back from that agency, the one I mentioned last month." Raymond looked up. "They have someone," Dominic continued, "a caregiver, different background from the others, not a therapist, not a behavioral specialist, just someone with good instincts and solid references." He paused, swirling the last of his coffee. "Might be worth a try. 11 hasn't worked. Maybe 12 is different." 12. Raymond turned the word over without meaning to. 11 people in 4 years, each one vetted, credentialed, carefully selected. Each one gone within weeks. The reasons were always different. The result was always the same. He thought about the way Noah had been sitting upstairs, the untouched train set, the signed basketball, the window. "Set it up," Raymond said. He picked up his briefcase and walked toward the front door without looking back. Behind him, he heard Dominic set down his mug, heard the quiet satisfaction in the small sound of it, the sound of something decided. On his way through the front hall, Raymond passed the wide staircase. He glanced up out of habit. Noah had come to the top of the stairs at some point in the last few minutes, silently, the way he moved everywhere, and was standing at the railing, bare tucked under one arm. He wasn't looking at his father. He was looking at Dominic. Dominic looked back. Just for a moment, a brief passing glance that lasted no longer than a second, before his expression rearranged itself into something gentle and avuncular. Noah didn't look away first. The mop handle was cheap plastic, the kind that bent slightly under real pressure, and Celeste Morgan had learned in the past 3 months exactly how much force it could take before it started to give. She knew this the way she now knew many small, practical things she had never needed to know before. Which cleaning products left streaks on marble, which brands of trash bags split at the corners, how long it took to properly sanitize a commercial restroom if you wanted to do it right and not just make it look right. She had learned these things without intending to the way you learn anything you do every day, whether you want to or not. 2 years ago, she had been arguing cases in a downtown Houston courtroom. She had worn tailored suits and carried a leather briefcase that had cost more than her first car. She had stood in front of judges and juries and spoken with the kind of quiet, grounded authority that takes years to develop and seconds to lose. One case, one corporation, one decision to fight when everyone around her said to let it go. The details didn't matter anymore. Not in the way they used to, not with the sharp, urgent weight they had carried during the 18 months of proceedings that followed. What mattered now was the outcome. Her license suspended pending review had never been reinstated. The firm she'd built from the ground up had quietly dissolved. The colleagues who had admired her had one by one stopped returning her calls. And so, here she was, Suite 4B of the Hargrove Financial Building, 9:30, on a Wednesday morning, running a mop across travertine floors, while the office's actual occupants arrived in their pressed clothes and set their coffee cups on their polished desks without glancing in her direction. She didn't blame them. She had been one of them once. Her phone buzzed in the pocket of her work pants. The practical dark-colored ones she wore specifically because they didn't show the cleaning solution that inevitably splashed, and she set the mop against the wall and answered, without checking the number. "Ms. Morgan." The voice on the other end was professional, clipped the voice of someone working through a list. "This is Patricia Webb from Cornerstone Household Staffing. We spoke briefly last week about potential placements." Celeste moved towards the hallway, away from the sound of the office filling up behind her. "I remember," she said. "We have a positions that just opened up. Live-in care for a child 7 years old in a private residence in the River Oaks area." A pause, the sound of papers. "The family is private. I'm not able to share the name at this stage, just that the compensation is well above standard. The household is well-staffed, and the child has some specific needs that previous caregivers have found challenging." "Challenging how?" Celeste asked. "He doesn't communicate verbally." Another pause, measured, careful. "The family is looking for someone with patience, stability, someone who can commit to a longer placement than they've managed to secure previously." Celeste leaned against the wall of the corridor and looked at the ceiling. River Oaks, private family, a child who didn't speak. She ran the numbers in her head without meaning to, the way she always had. Automatically, the lawyer's habit of assessing what was on the table before deciding whether to sit down. The compensation Patricia had mentioned would cover 4 months of what she currently owed on the studio apartment she'd moved into after giving up the lease on her townhouse. It would mean stopping the slow grinding math she did every night before she went to sleep, the mental accounting that always ended in the same uncomfortable place. "I appreciate the call," Celeste said. "Can I have until this evening to decide?" "Of course. I'll need an answer by 7. She hung up and stood in the corridor for a moment, listening to the ordinary sounds of a working morning printer's conversation, someone's phone playing a few bars of a ringtone before it was silenced. The cleaning cart sat at the end of the hall, waiting for her to finish the last 2 offices before the noon deadline. She went back to the mop, but the call stayed with her for the rest of the morning, circling quietly at the back of her mind while she worked. Not because of the money, though the money mattered. Not because of the address, though River Oaks meant something in this city. It was something else, something she couldn't name precisely and didn't entirely trust, which was exactly why she kept trying to set it aside and kept finding it waiting for her when she turned back around. By the time she got home, a studio apartment on the 4th floor of a building whose elevator worked about 60% of the time, it was just past 2 in the afternoon. She changed out of her work clothes, made coffee she didn't particularly want, and sat down on the edge of the bed. Then she opened the drawer of the small nightstand beside it. She didn't open it often, maybe once a month, sometimes less, just enough to confirm that what was inside was still there, still sealed, still waiting. A plain white envelope, legal-sized, her name written across the front in handwriting that had once been confident and had come out of the pen shaking. 4 years of sitting in that drawer had faded the ink at the edges. The seal was still intact. Lauren had pressed it into her hands on a Thursday afternoon in this very city, in the parking structure outside a coffee shop where they had met under the pretense of discussing a referral. "If anything ever happens to me," Lauren had said, "find a way to get this to someone who can actually do something with it. Someone who isn't afraid of powerful people." 3 days later, Lauren was gone. Celeste had carried the envelope through the collapse of her career, through 2 moves, and a bankruptcy filing, and every dark morning that followed, and she had never opened it. Not because she didn't want to, because she was afraid of what opening it would require her to do next. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she placed it back in the drawer, closed it, and picked up her phone. "Patricia," she said when the call connected. "It's Celeste Morgan. I'll take the position." She set the phone down and reached for her bag, pulling it onto the bed and unzipping the main compartment to begin sorting through what she would need to pack for a live-in arrangement. Her movements were deliberate, organized, the muscle memory of someone who had once managed complicated logistics without breaking stride. But her hands, when she finally noticed them, were not quite steady. She told herself it was just a job. but her hands disagreed. In the nightstand drawer, the envelope waited. Lauren's handwriting, faded to near white. At the edges, the seal still unbroken, the contents still unknown after 4 years of patient silence. The gate was the first thing she noticed. Black iron, tall and unhurried, the kind that didn't need a sign to communicate what it was protecting. A small brass plate was mounted on the left pillar, polished, understated, visible only to someone already looking. Holt. Celeste sat in the ride chair for a moment after it stopped looking at that name through the window. She had heard it before, in courtrooms, in depositions, in the particular way. People said certain names when they wanted to signal that the conversation had just entered more complicated territory. She picked up her bag and got out of the car. A woman was waiting just inside the gate, mid-50s, practical shoes, the expression of someone who had made peace with saying difficult things to new people on a regular basis. She introduced herself as Mrs. Garner, the outgoing caregiver, the one who had lasted the longest of the 11, and was now leaving for reasons she delivered in a flat, rehearsed tone that made clear she had decided not to get into it. "I'll show you around," Mrs. Garner said, already turning toward the house. "I have a flight at 4. She talked as they walked, the steady, efficient debrief of someone passing a difficult shift to the next person in line. The household schedule, the staff contacts, Noah's meals, his routine, his room. She covered it all without breaking stride. And when they reached the front steps, she paused with one hand on the door. "He won't respond to direct questions," she said. "He won't make eye contact most days. He won't come to you. The previous caregivers all made the same mistake. They kept trying to get him to engage on their terms. A beat. He doesn't work that way." "What happened to them?" Celeste asked. "The previous ones." Mrs. Garner looked at her with the expression of someone deciding how honest to be. "They left," she said. "One way or another, they all leave." She pushed the door open. "I'm not saying it to discourage you, just so you're not surprised." Inside the house was exactly what the exterior had prepared her for: high ceilings, a curving staircase, art on the walls chosen by someone who understood it. The floors absorbed sound rather than reflecting it, which should have made the space feel warmer. It didn't. Raymond Holt was waiting in the main sitting room, standing, not sitting, the kind of man who treated stillness as readiness rather than rest. He shook her hand, outlined his expectations in precise sentences, and assessed her with the careful eyes of someone who had done this 11 times before and was not optimistic about the 12th. The conversation lasted 10 minutes. When it was over, he excused himself and was gone. Mrs. Garner led her upstairs. Noah's room was at the end of the hall door, half open. Mrs. Garner knocked twice, announced Celeste, and stepped back. Celeste moved into the doorway. The boy was on the floor near the far window, back to the door, as though neither the knock nor the announcement had registered. Small for 7, or maybe just undersized against the room's high ceilings and wide floors. He didn't turn around. "Hi, Noah," Celeste said. "I'm Celeste. I'll be spending some time with you." He didn't move. She hadn't expected him to. She stood for a moment, without filling the silence, looking at the untouched toys along one wall, the books with uncracked spines, the small worn bear tucked under his arm that was clearly not a decoration. Then she turned to follow Mrs. Garner back down the hall. That was when she saw it. A framed photograph near the top of the stairs. A woman, mid-30s, caught mid-laugh, the kind of photograph that captures someone before they realize they're being photographed, which is always when people look most like themselves, standing in a garden sunlight behind her, one hand raised as if waving off the camera. Celeste stopped walking. She knew that face. She had sat across from it in a coffee shop booth 4 years ago, watching those same hands wrap around a paper cup, watching that same face try very hard to stay composed while describing something that frightened her deeply. Lauren. The word arrived in her chest before it reached her mind, below thought, below confirmation. This was Lauren's house. Lauren's husband. Lauren's son. The boy at the end of the hall, the one who hadn't spoken in 4 years, was the same child Lauren had been trying to protect. Mrs. Garner was already on the stairs, still talking something about the kitchen schedule and the alarm code. Celeste followed. Her expression didn't change. Her voice, when she responded, came out exactly as it should. She said nothing about the photograph. She asked no questions about the woman in it. It wasn't the right moment, and she had learned in the hardest way available the difference between the right moment and simply the urgent one. From somewhere down the hall behind her, a sound drifted out, faint, rhythmic, deliberate, coming from Noah's room. Not crying, not talking, something quieter and more purposeful. A repeated motion like something being turned or and over in careful hands, examined from every angle, kept very close. She didn't stop walking, but she didn't stop listening either. Nobody told Celeste how to do this part. There were no protocols in the agency paperwork for what happened after the introductions were over and the outgoing caregiver's car had pulled away and the house settled back into its particular brand of quiet. There was no handbook for how to spend the first morning with a child who had decided at some point before you arrived that the world outside his own head was not worth engaging with. So she made coffee she didn't particularly need, carried it to the small sitting area off the main hall, and opened the book she'd brought. She read. She didn't go upstairs to check on Noah. She didn't position herself outside his door. She didn't arrange activities on the kitchen table or call his name or do any of the things that probably felt to the people who'd tried them like reasonable first steps. She just existed in the house quietly and let the house get used to her. The first day, Noah didn't come downstairs at all. She heard him moving above her soft footsteps, crossing the floor of his room, the occasional sound of something being set down, and picked up again. But he didn't appear, and she didn't go up to find him. At noon, she made lunch, left a portion on the kitchen counter with a glass of juice, and went back to her book. When she checked an hour later, the plate was empty. He'd come down while she wasn't watching. That was fine. That was, in fact, exactly what she'd hoped for. The second day followed the same pattern, and the third. She kept her movements predictable. The same chair, the same general hours, the same unhurried rhythm that she hoped communicated, without words, that she wasn't going anywhere and wasn't expecting anything. She spoke occasionally, not to him specifically, but just aloud, the way people talk to themselves when they're comfortable in a space. A comment about the weather through the window, a quiet remark about something she'd read. Not conversation, just sound. The sound of someone present, without being demanding. On the fourth day, she was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a legal pad. Old habit, she still thought better when she could write things down when she heard the footsteps on the stairs. Slow, deliberate, stopping halfway. She didn't look up. The footsteps didn't continue for almost 2 full minutes. She turned a page on the legal pad and wrote something that didn't mean anything, just to give her hands something to do. Then the footsteps resumed, reached the bottom of the stairs, crossed the hallway, and stopped again just outside the kitchen doorway. She could feel him standing there. She kept her eyes on the pad. After a long moment, the footsteps retreated back upstairs. She let out a slow breath and took a sip of her tea. Progress, she thought. Not the kind anyone else would have recognized as progress, but she recognized it. The fifth day, he came all the way in. She was at the same table, same chair, same unremarkable posture when Noah walked into the kitchen and sat down at the opposite end of the table, 4 chairs away, as far as the table allowed, but at the table. He set the worn bear in front of him, folded his hands, and looked at the surface of the wood. Celeste glanced up briefly. "Morning," she said, the way you'd say it to anyone sharing a table at a coffee shop. Then she looked back down at her pad. He stayed for 40 minutes. He didn't speak. He didn't look at her directly. But he stayed, and when he left, he took the bear with him and walked back upstairs without hurrying, which felt to Celeste like the difference between retreating and simply leaving. The 6th day, he came down earlier, sat 3 chairs away instead of 4. On the 7th day, he brought something else with him. Celeste was finishing her morning coffee when she heard him on the stairs, and then he was in the kitchen moving not to his usual chair, but around the table toward her side. He stopped when he was one chair away. He set the bear down on the table in front of her. Then he pulled out the chair beside her, sat down, and turned to look at the window. Not at her, at the window, but one chair away, not four. And the bear, his bear, the one he carried everywhere, the one he held while he slept and kept under his arm while he sat, and had never in the 7 days she'd been in this house set down anywhere except directly beside himself, was sitting in front of her. Celeste looked at it. It was more worn than she'd realized up close. The fur rubbed thin on the ears, and along the seams, the stitching at the left paw, redone in a slightly different thread, the kind of repairs made by someone who was trying to preserve something carefully and indefinitely. One button eye was newer than the other, a slightly different shade of brown. Someone had taken care of this thing for a long time. She reached out and picked it up. It was heavier than she expected. Not dramatically so, not the kind of weight that announced itself, but present in a way that a stuffed bear filled only with batting shouldn't quite be. A density toward the center that didn't move the way stuffing moved. She held it for a moment, turning it slightly, saying nothing. Noah was still looking at the window. His hands were flat on the table. His breathing was even. She set the bear back down in front of him, gently, exactly as she'd found it. He picked it up without looking at it and tucked it back under his arm, and they sat together at the kitchen table while the morning light moved across the floor, and neither of them said a word. She wasn't sure what she'd felt. She only knew she didn't want to put it down. It started with a handshake that lasted 3 seconds too long. Celeste had been in the house for 9 days. When Dominic Holt arrived on a Saturday afternoon, announced expected, welcomed by Raymond with the easy familiarity of two men who had shared enough history that the formalities had long since worn off. He came through the front door with the relaxed confidence of someone who had walked through it hundreds of times, before a bottle of wine in one hand, and the unhurried energy of a man who considered himself, in any room he entered, among the most important people present. He was Raymond's cousin. She had been told this during the initial briefing, along with his title, CFO of Holt Industries, the man who had helped Raymond hold the company together in the years after Lauren. He was well-dressed, well-spoken, the kind of handsome that came from careful maintenance rather than good fortune. And when Raymond introduced him to Celeste in the front hall, Dominic took her hand and held it just slightly longer than a greeting required. "Celeste," he said, as though the name itself were interesting. "Ray's told me about you, the new one." "That's me," she said, evenly retrieving her hand. His smile didn't shift. "We've all been hoping the right person would come along. 12 is a lucky number, some say." She didn't respond to that. He didn't seem to require her to. In the sitting room, while Raymond poured drinks, and the afternoon light came through the tall windows at a low amber angle, Dominic settled into conversation with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years being good at rooms. He asked Celeste questions, her background, her experience with children, what had drawn her to this kind of work. The questions themselves were unremarkable. It was the pace of them that caught her attention. Too steady, too thorough, the rhythm of someone conducting an assessment while appearing to make small talk. She answered carefully, giving him the shape of information, without the substance, the way she'd once done in depositions when the opposing counsel was fishing. At some point, Noah appeared in the doorway. He stood there for a moment, long enough for Dominic to turn, and notice him long enough for Dominic to arrange his expression into something warm and avuncular, and say, "Hey, buddy, come sit with us." Noah looked at his father, then at Dominic. Then he turned and walked back down the hallway toward the stairs without a word, his steps unhurried, his departure so clean and complete that it left a brief silence in the room. "He does that," Raymond said, the flat resignation of a man who had stopped trying to explain it. Dominic nodded slowly. "He'll come around." His tone was reassuring, practiced. His eyes, for just a fraction of a second, moved to Celeste. She was already looking at her glass. Over dinner, which Dominic stayed for, naturally, because he was the kind of person who stayed for things. He spoke about Celeste with a generosity that should have felt like a compliment, and instead felt like something being established. He praised her patience, her calm approach, her instincts with a difficult situation. He said it all directly to Raymond in the third person, as though she weren't at the table, as though he were making a record of something. Raymond listened and nodded, and seemed genuinely to appreciate it. Celeste ate her dinner and said very little and filed everything away. After the meal, Raymond took a call in his study, something from overseas, something that couldn't wait, and Celeste excused herself to the kitchen to clear the remaining dishes. The house settled into its after-dinner quiet, the kind that came when the performance of a social evening had ended, and everyone had retreated to their separate corners. She was rinsing a glass at the sink when she heard Dominic's voice from the hallway, low, private, the register of a phone call not intended to carry. She turned off the faucet. Handled it fine tonight. Very composed. A pause, listening. No, I don't think she knows anything. She's careful, though. Another pause longer. Doesn't matter. She won't last. None of them do. His voice dropped another register, smooth and certain. Make sure of it. The silence that followed was the kind that comes after something has been decided. Celeste stood at the sink with a dish towel in her hands and did not move. She was aware of her own breathing, the conscious effort of keeping it even, keeping her feet exactly where they were, keeping her expression pointed at the window above the sink, in case anyone walked in and needed her to look like someone who had heard nothing. She counted to 15. Then she dried the glass, set it on the counter, and walked back toward the hallway. Dominic was gone. The front hall was empty, his coat no longer on the hook by the door, the house already adjusting to his absence. The way a room adjusts after a window is closed, a subtle shift in pressure, a return to something more breathable. She stood for a moment at the bottom of the stairs. Then she looked up. Noah was at the top of the hallway, standing just outside his bedroom door, still dressed, arms at his sides. The hour was late enough that he should have been asleep, and under any other circumstances, she might have been concerned. But he wasn't the posture of a child who had wandered out half awake. He was standing the way people stand when they have been waiting deliberately, with full attention, for something specific to happen. He was looking directly at her, not past her, not at the wall or the floor or the middle distance he usually occupied. At her. His expression was not afraid, and not confused, and not any of the things she might have expected. It was something else, something older than 7 years had any business being. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once, small, deliberate, and turned and walked back into his room and pulled the door nearly closed behind him. Celeste stood at the bottom of the stairs for a long time. After that, one hand resting on the banister, the house quiet around her. She wasn't sure exactly what had just passed between them, but she understood with the same instinct that had once made her a very good lawyer that it had meant something. By 2 a.m, the house had gone fully quiet, the kind of quiet that only arrives in the small hours when even the building itself seems to have stopped paying attention. Celeste was lying on her bed, with the light off, and her eyes open, and she had been that way for the better part of an hour. Not restless, not anxious, in the ordinary sense, just awake in the particular way that happens. When your mind has found something, it refuses to set down, turning it over and over, the way a tongue finds a sore tooth. She won't last. None of them do. Make sure of it. She had heard those words clearly. She had no doubt about what they meant, and she had no doubt that the man who said them had said similar things before, possibly many times, possibly, about each of the 11 people who had come through this house before her and eventually left. What she couldn't stop circling was the texture of it. Not angry, not panicked, calm, certain. The voice of someone maintaining something, not someone reacting to it. That was what kept her awake. And beneath that, beneath the calculating part of her mind that was already sorting and categorizing, was something older and less organized. A memory. A voice she hadn't let herself think about clearly in a long time, coming back now, with the particular insistence of things that have been deliberately avoided. They will try to discredit anyone who gets close, Lauren had said in that coffee shop booth 4 years ago. both hands around her cup, her voice low and even and controlled in the way of someone who has practiced staying calm while describing something that terrifies them. That's how it works. Not with confrontation, with patience. They just remove people, quietly, until no one is left who knows enough to matter. Celeste had asked her who she meant by they. Lauren had looked at her for a long moment before answering. Then she'd said one name. Celeste sat up in the dark. She reached for the bag she kept on the chair beside the bed, the one she'd packed in her studio apartment 12 days ago, with hands that wouldn't quite steady, and she found it by touch, unzipped the inner pocket, and withdrew the envelope. It was lighter than she remembered. Or maybe she had just been carrying the weight of it for so long in her head that the physical object had started to seem like it should be heavier. She held it for a moment in both hands, the way she had done dozens of times over 4 years without opening it. The paper had softened slightly with age. The writing on the front, her name in Lauren's careful hand, had faded at the edges, the way ink does when it stops being looked at. She opened it. The contents were folded in thirds, the way legal documents were folded. And there were more pages than she'd expected. 8 or 9 sheets, some printed, some handwritten, paper-clipped in 2 separate groups. She moved to the window, where the ambient light from the grounds below was just enough to read by, and she began. The printed pages were financial records, account statements, transfer, histories, internal memos, formatted with the Holt Industries letterhead she now recognized. The numbers were specific, and the dates were precise, and the pattern they described, once she understood what she was looking at, was not subtle. Money moving from subsidiary accounts into holdings that didn't appear on any public filing. Transfers timed to coincide with quarterly reporting periods, small enough individually to avoid triggering automatic flags, large enough collectively to represent something that would end careers and reputations and freedoms. Lauren had not been guessing. She had documentation. The handwritten pages were different in tone, faster, less composed, the writing of someone working against time, or nerve, or both, names, account numbers, dates, and on the last page, in letters slightly larger than the rest, underlined twice, with the kind of pressure that leaves an impression in the paper beneath Dominic. Below it, a single line, "He will come for this." Celeste lowered the pages. She stood at the window for a moment, breathing carefully and letting the information reorganize itself in her mind, the way facts do when they stop being abstract and become real, when they attach themselves to faces and voices, and the specific memory of a handshake that lasted 3 seconds too long. Lauren had known. She had known exactly what Dominic was doing and exactly what it meant, and she had spent what turned out to be the last days of her life trying to make sure the information survived her. She had walked into a coffee shop and handed an envelope to the one person she trusted to do something with it, a lawyer who fought powerful people for a living, and 3 days later, she was gone. And Dominic was still here. He was in this house. He came and went through the front door with a bottle of wine and easy conversation, and Raymond's complete and unquestioning trust. And he had been doing it for 4 years, and nobody had asked a single question. Celeste folded the pages back along their original creases and returned them to the envelope. She did this slowly, deliberately, with the focus of someone who needed their hands to be doing something specific, while their mind worked through something large. Then she looked out the window. The guest wing sat at the far end of the property's east side, a separate structure connected to the main house by a covered walkway, used, she had been told, when Dominic stayed over, rather than making the drive back across the city. His car was still in the drive. She hadn't known he was staying tonight. The window of the room he used was lit. At 2:15 in the morning, behind that lit window, something was moving. A shadow, intermittent, the shape of a person crossing and recrossing in front of a desk lamp. He was still awake, still working, still here. She stood at her window and looked at his and the distance between them, the dark lawn, the garden lights, the quiet that covered everything. Felt suddenly much smaller than it had before she opened that envelope. He was still there, 2 floors above the boy, who had never forgotten his face. Morning came in through the east-facing windows of the house, the way it always did, gradually. Without announcement, the kind of light that arrived before anyone was ready for it and stayed regardless. Celeste had slept for perhaps 3 hours. She knew this not because she'd watched the clock, but because she recognized the particular quality of functioning on too little rest, the slight delay between thought and action, the way ordinary sounds seemed to arrive half a beat late. She made coffee with the careful movements of someone conserving energy, and she was standing at the kitchen counter with the first cup when she heard Noah on the stairs. He came in the way he always did, quietly. No announcement, his presence registering before she saw him. But something was different this morning, and she felt it before she could have explained it. The rhythm of his steps, maybe. Or the way he came directly into the kitchen, instead of pausing in the doorway first. He sat down, not at the far end of the table, not 3 chairs away or 2. He sat 1 chair away, which was where he'd been yesterday. And he set the bear on the table, in front of him, the way he usually did. And he looked at her, not at the table, not at the window, at her. Celeste held his gaze and said nothing. She had learned in the past week and a half that with Noah, the wrong word at the wrong moment could close a door that had taken days to open. So she just looked back at him steadily, the way you look at someone when you want them to know they have your full attention and none of your expectations. He held her gaze for a long moment, then he picked up the bear. He didn't hand it to her right away. He held it first, both hands, the way he always held it securely, with the unconscious grip of long habit. He looked down at it briefly, something passing across his face that was too quick and too complicated for Celeste to fully read. Then he extended it toward her, not set it on the table, and pushed it across, extended it, held it out directly, arms reaching, the gesture deliberate and unambiguous. She took it. His eyes came up immediately, watching her face with an attention that reminded her suddenly and precisely of the way very young children watch adults when they've done something important and are waiting to see if the adult understands. The bear was heavier than it should have been. She'd noticed this before, briefly, peripherally, in the way you notice something that doesn't quite fit without yet knowing what category to put it in. But this morning, holding it properly, with both hands, the weight was unmistakable. Not dramatically so. Not the kind of thing that would register if you were just picking it up and putting it down again. But if you were holding it with attention, if you were a person whose professional training had involved learning to notice the things that were slightly off, you felt it. A density toward the center. A solidity that shifted differently from stuffing when she tilted the bear slightly to one side. Something was inside it. Her pulse did something involuntary. She kept her face still. Noah was watching her with those careful, serious eyes, and she understood with the same instinct she'd been relying on since she walked through the front gate of this house, that this was intentional. He had given it to her this way, this morning, for a reason. He wanted her to feel what she was feeling. He wanted her to know. She turned the bear over slowly in her hands, examining the seams with her fingers, looking for the place where something might have been inserted. The stitching along the back seam was slightly different from the rest. The thread a little newer, the tension a little tighter, the kind of careful repair work done not by a factory, but by a person who needed something to stay closed and stay closed well. Her thumb found the edge of it. She looked up at Noah. He was still watching her, still waiting. She slid her thumbnail along the edge of the seam, feeling for the point where the stitching could be worked loose without doing damage. And she had just found it, just identified the exact stitch where the repair began when the sound reached her. Footsteps, not the household staff, whose movements she had learned to identify by weight and pattern over the past 10 days. Not Raymond, who was already gone. She'd heard his car on the drive before 6. These were different, measured, unhurried, moving along the hallway that ran past the kitchen toward the rear of the house. and they were close enough that whoever was making them would pass the kitchen doorway within seconds. Dominic. His car. She hadn't heard it leave. He'd stayed the night she'd known that, and she hadn't heard him go. Noah moved. He didn't lunge or scramble. He reached across the table with the swift, quiet efficiency of a child who had practiced being invisible for years and took the bear from her hands in one smooth motion. By the time he had it back against his chest, his posture had already resettled into the ordinary stillness that was his default sitting at the table. Eyes lowered, looking like nothing had happened. The footsteps slowed, passed, continued down the hall, in a way diminishing into the far end of the house. In the silence that followed, Celeste became aware that she'd been holding her breath. She released it slowly through her nose without moving. She looked at Noah. He was already looking at her. The bear was tucked back under his arm, exactly where it always was, exactly as though it had never left. But his eyes, still on hers, said something that his voice didn't need to. He gave one small, careful shake of his head. Not yet. Not here. Not now. Not with those footsteps still somewhere in the house. Celeste nodded once, barely perceptibly, and reached for her coffee cup. Her hand was steady. She made sure of it. Outside the kitchen window, the morning had fully arrived. Blue sky, the groundskeeper's truck parked at the far end of the drive. An ordinary Houston day, arranging itself with complete indifference to what had just passed between a woman and a 7-year-old boy at a kitchen table. Whatever was inside that bear had been waiting for 4 years. It could wait a little longer. She came downstairs just after 10, when the house had gone quiet in the way it did on evenings when the staff had finished for the day and retreated to their respective quarters and the rooms settled back into themselves. She hadn't planned to linger. A glass of water, maybe something small from the kitchen, and back upstairs. That had been the intention. The day had been long, in the way that days are long when they contain too much thinking, and she had been looking forward to the particular blankness of lying down in the dark and letting her mind stop organizing things for a few hours. The kitchen light was off, but the sitting room off the main hall was not entirely dark. There was the low amber glow of a single lamp in the far corner, and in the chair beneath it, Raymond Holt was sitting alone. He had a glass in his hand. The bottle on the side table beside him was about a third full, which told her it had been fuller earlier. He was not slumped or glassy-eyed. Raymond did not appear to be a man who lost his composure easily, even in private, but there was something in the set of his shoulders and the angle of his head that was different from the version of him she had encountered in daylit rooms. Looser somehow. The careful architecture of his professional bearing had come down a few inches, the way walls do when no one is watching them. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. "Sorry," she said. "I was just getting some water. It's fine." He said it without the clipped efficiency of his usual register. Not warm exactly, but not the closed door either. "You don't have to go." She hesitated a moment, then went to the kitchen, filled a glass at the tap, and came back. She sat in the chair across from him, not close, not presuming, and he looked at his glass and said nothing for a while, and she let the silence be what it was. It was Raymond who broke it. "She used to sit in that chair," he said. He didn't explain who. He didn't need to. Celeste said nothing. She held her glass in both hands and waited. "Lauren." He said this name the way people say names they have trained themselves to say evenly, and have not entirely succeeded. She liked this room at night. Said the lamp made it feel smaller. She liked rooms that felt smaller than they were. He took a sip of his drink. "I never understood that," he said. "I built this house to feel large." She kept finding the corners of it. Celeste looked at him. In the low light, he seemed older than he did during the day. Not in a diminished way, but in the way that people seem more like themselves when the performance has stopped. The lines around his eyes, the way his hand rested on the arm of the chair, not gripping it, just resting. "She sounds like she knew what she needed," Celeste said quietly. Raymond considered that. She usually did. A pause. "I was not always good at listening." The words came out with the particular weight of something that had been carried a long time, compressed by repetition into something small and dense. Not self-pity, something more honest than that. He was quiet for a moment. Then, unprompted, in the way things surface, late at night, when the usual defenses have grown tired, he said, "I wasn't there. The night of the fire." Celeste kept her expression still. "I know people assume." He stopped. Started again. "The report said I was home, that I arrived shortly after the fire department. That's what the timeline shows." He looked at his glass. "But I wasn't there when it started. I was across the city. A meeting that came up that afternoon, urgent, apparently. Couldn't wait." He said the last two words with a flatness that carried 4 years of something underneath it. "Raymond," Celeste said carefully, "you don't have to—" "I've never told anyone that," he said. Not defensively, just as a fact. Not because I was hiding it, because saying it out loud makes it— He stopped again, set his glass down on the side table with a small, final sound. She was alone. Lauren was alone, and Noah was 3 years old, and I was in a conference room on the other side of Houston because someone told me it was urgent. The lamp hummed softly. Outside, the grounds were dark and still. "You couldn't have known," Celeste said. "No." He agreed with it immediately, the way people agree with things they have told themselves 1,000 times, and stopped believing. "I couldn't have known." They sat with that for a moment. He reached for his glass again, then changed his mind and left it where it was. He looked at the window, at the dark rectangle of it, the faint reflection of the lamp in the glass. "If I had been there," he began. He didn't finish it. The sentence just stopped hanging in the warm air of the room, and Celeste understood that he had started it many times and never found an ending for it that helped. The silence stretched. Then, in the distracted way of someone whose mind had moved on to something adjacent, the way thoughts drift at the end of a long night, he said, "Dominic was the first one who called me that night." His voice had changed registers slightly, quieter, more internal. The tone of a man recalling something he had not thought about in a while, something that had been filed under the wrong category for a long time. "I remember because I was still in the parking structure when my phone rang. Before the fire department called. Before anyone else." He looked at nothing in particular. "I always thought I don't know what I thought. That he must have been nearby, or heard it on the scanner." A small pause. "I never asked him." Celeste set her glass down on the side table. The sound it made was very small. Raymond didn't seem to notice it, but something had shifted in the room. Something invisible, something that had nothing to do with the lamp, or the hour, or the level of the bottle on the table. A piece had moved into a position it had not occupied before, and the picture it was part of was becoming slowly and irreversibly harder to look away from. She didn't go back to bed. Instead, she climbed the stairs to her room, closed the door quietly behind her, and sat on the edge of the mattress for a long moment with her hands in her lap, listening to the house settle around her. Down the hall, Noah's room was dark and silent. Below, she could hear the faint sound of Raymond moving through the house, the slow, deliberate sounds of a man ending a difficult evening and finding his way to sleep. She waited until those sounds stopped. Then she opened her laptop. The detail Raymond had offered, casually, almost parenthetically, in the way people offer the things that have been sitting in the wrong drawer of their memory for years, had not left her since she'd heard it. "Dominic was the first one who called me that night. Before the fire department. Before anyone else. A man who, according to everything Celeste now knew about him, had very specific reasons to want to be the first voice Raymond heard in those initial minutes. The first voice shaping the story. The first one in position to manage what Raymond noticed and what he didn't. She opened a search window and started simply the way she always had, with the most basic version of the question, and let the details accumulate. The agency Patricia Webb worked for kept sparse public records, but it maintained a professional directory that listed placements by household, a feature designed for reference purposes, the kind of thing intended for background checks and professional verifications. Celeste had used tools like it in her previous life, and she knew how to read them. She found the Holt household listing in 4 minutes. 11 names, dates of placement, dates of departure. Some had stayed 2 weeks. Some had lasted nearly 2 months. The longest tenure before her own had been Mrs. Garner, 63 days, which explained why she had been the one to do the handover briefing with the flat, rehearsed tone of someone who had decided not to get into it. Celeste opened a separate document and began building a simple timeline, names on the left, dates in the middle, and a third column she left blank for now. Then she started searching each name individually. The first, a woman who had left after 3 weeks, had filed a complaint with her staffing agency, citing a missing personal item, a watch. She had not pressed the matter formally, and the complaint had been closed without resolution. Date of Dominic's last visit before her departure 2 days prior. The second had stepped away, following what a mutual professional contact described in a forum post Celeste found after 20 minutes of searching as a misunderstanding about some household property. No further details. Dominic's most recent visit 4 days before she left. The third, the fourth, the fifth. Each one different in the specifics. A piece of jewelry, a small amount of cash from a household account, a set of keys that turned up missing, and then after the caregiver had gone quietly reappeared. The incidents were minor enough that none had escalated to formal proceedings, which was Celeste recognized precisely the point. Large enough to create doubt, small enough to avoid scrutiny. She filled in the third column as she went. By the time she reached the 7th name, the pattern had stopped being a pattern and had become something more deliberate. The kind of repetition that doesn't happen by accident, that requires someone maintaining it, adjusting it slightly each time to avoid recognition, keeping the mechanism running smoothly across years and personnel changes, and the ordinary turnover of household staff. She sat back and looked at her screen. 11 caregivers, 11 departures, 11 incidents, each one arriving within days of a visit from the man who was by every outward measure simply Raymond's devoted cousin, doing his best to support a grieving family through a difficult time. She thought about the way Dominic had looked at her across the dinner table, the questions he'd asked, too thorough, too steady, the rhythm of an assessment. She thought about the phone call she'd heard from the kitchen. She won't last. None of them do. Make sure of it. She understood now what make sure of it meant. It wasn't a threat directed at her specifically. It was a standing instruction, a protocol that had been running for 4 years, maintained with the same quiet, patient efficiency that Dominic brought to everything he did. The question was why. She already knew part of the answer. The financial records in Lauren's envelope, the transfers, the carefully constructed paper trail of someone helping himself to a company that wasn't his. Caregivers who got close to Noah were a risk. A child who had been present on the night of the fire, a child who had tried to tell someone something in a hospital room and been told to rest that child if he ever found the right person, if he ever felt safe enough, could say things that no amount of document management could undo. So Dominic kept the circle small. He kept Noah isolated. He did it without ever raising a hand, without ever making a scene, just a missing watch here, a misplaced key, there a quiet word to Raymond. And another name crossed off the list. Celeste looked at the document on her screen. 11 names in the left column, 11 dates, 11 neat little incidents that had one by one kept a 7-year-old boy alone in a house with the one person who had the most to lose from him ever speaking. She thought about Noah at the kitchen table this morning. The bear extended toward her arms, reaching the gesture deliberate and unambiguous. The weight of it in her hands, the way he had watched her face to see if she understood. He had been trying to show someone for a long time. He had just never had anyone in the house long enough to show. She closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a while, not thinking about next steps, not planning, just letting the full shape of it settle into place. Outside her window, Houston was doing what cities do in the early hours, running on its own momentum, indifferent and continuous. She was number 12. In 4 years, Dominic had been meticulous. He had been patient. He had been, by any practical measure, effective. He had looked at a parade of caregivers and seen exactly what he needed to see: people who could be managed, removed, and replaced without disrupting the larger arrangement he had spent years constructing. He had looked at Celeste Morgan and seen the same thing. He had not looked closely enough. 12. She was number 12. And this time, Dominic had made a mistake. He had let in the one person Lauren had already trusted. Dominic Holt had not maintained what he had built for 4 years by being slow to notice things. He noticed the way Celeste moved through the house, not the movement of someone settling in, finding her rhythm, learning the geography of a new placement. Something more deliberate than that. She paid attention to the wrong things. She lingered in doorways. She asked the household staff questions that sounded casual and weren't. She had been there less than 3 weeks, and already she had the quality of someone assembling something piece by piece in a place where no one was supposed to be assembling anything. He had seen it first in the small things. The way she went quiet when his name came up. The way her eyes moved briefly, and then away, whenever he referenced the years before the transition period, as he had always thought of it privately, the years since Lauren. He had watched 11 people come through this house, and not one of them had looked at him quite the way Celeste Morgan looked at him when she thought he wasn't paying attention. He was always paying attention. The decision, when he made it, came with the same clean simplicity that had guided every decision before it. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would require explanation. Just the mechanism adjusted slightly, for this particular situation, applied with the same quiet patience that had worked reliably 11 times before. He chose a Thursday. Raymond was in the house. That was important. The incident needed a witness who was also the decision maker, and Raymond needed to be present for the initial discovery to land correctly. Dominic arrived mid-morning, a folder of documents under his arm, the ordinary pretext of business that required in-person review. He greeted Raymond in the study, spent 40 minutes going through figures that could have been handled by email, and on his way out of the study, he stopped in the hallway near the cabinet that stood between the sitting room and the main staircase. Lauren's clock was there. It had always been there, a small carriage clock in a brass case, French early 20th century, the kind of object that occupied a fixed point in a room for so long that it became part of the room's definition. Raymond had never moved it. Celeste would have seen it every day. That was what mattered. Dominic paused beside it, adjusted the folder under his arm, and kept walking. By early afternoon, the clock was no longer on the cabinet. He gave it 2 hours. Let the absence establish itself. Let it become something that had been noticed by the housekeeper, by Raymond, passing through, by anyone who walked that hallway, and registered, without quite articulating it, that something in the visual geography of the space had changed. Then he came back into the main house from the east walkway, found Raymond in the kitchen, and said, in the careful tone of someone reluctant to raise something unpleasant, "Ray, have you seen Lauren's clock?" "Soulmate? I see." Raymond looked up from his coffee. "What do you mean? It's not on the cabinet." A pause, waited, managed. "I noticed it when I came through just now. I didn't want to say anything without checking, but..." He let the sentence stop there, in the way sentences stop when the speaker wants the listener to complete them. Raymond set down his cup and walked to the hallway. He stood in front of the empty cabinet for a moment. Something moved across his face. Not quite anger, not quite distress, but the particular expression of a man for whom that clock was not simply an object. Celeste had seen it. She had registered it. Dominic was certain of that she registered everything. "The security system," Raymond said. It was not quite a question. "Already pulled it up," Dominic said. He had his phone out. The security application was open. The relevant camera feed cued to the timestamp he needed. He handed it to Raymond. The footage showed the hallway from above the cabinet, the clock visible in the lower right corner of the frame. It ran for approximately 40 seconds, and then, at a precise moment, it stuttered. A brief dropout, no more than 3 or 4 seconds. The kind of interruption that the system logged as a routine connectivity gap. The sort of minor technical irregularity that occurred once or twice a month in any residential system of this size, and was never investigated because it was never significant. Except that this particular gap coincided exactly with the window during which the clock had been moved. After the gap, the hallway resumed. The cabinet was visible. The space where the clock had been was empty. Raymond watched it twice. Then he handed the phone back without speaking. "I'm sure there's an explanation," Dominic said. His voice carried the specific texture of a man who was sure of no such thing and wanted that to be understood. "These things are usually straightforward." Another pause. "I just thought you should know." He watched Raymond's face carefully as Raymond turned and looked down the hallway toward the back of the house, toward the kitchen, where Celeste had been an hour ago, toward the stairs, toward the general territory that Celeste occupied. It took less than 15 seconds. That was all it ever took. Plant the absence, provide the gap, let the geometry of suspicion do the rest. Raymond's jaw tightened slightly. It was a small movement. Anyone else might have missed it. Dominic did not miss it. He excused himself shortly afterward, citing an afternoon meeting, leaving Raymond standing in the hallway with the particular stillness of a man whose mind was working through something it didn't want to be working through. As Dominic moved toward the front door, he heard Raymond's footsteps heading toward the kitchen. He didn't stay to watch the conversation. He didn't need to. Some hours later, after the household had gone through the subdued and uncomfortable process of a missing object that no one could locate, and everyone was thinking about, without saying so, directly, Celeste found Raymond in the doorway of the sitting room. He didn't say anything to her directly. He didn't accuse, didn't raise his voice, didn't do any of the things that would have given her something concrete to respond to. He just looked at her. It was the looking that was the problem. The careful, measuring quality of it. The slight withdrawal behind the eyes of a man who had, until this morning, been moving slowly, incrementally, toward something that resembled trust. The footage showed exactly what Dominic needed it to show. And Raymond, the man who had survived everything, looked at Celeste like she was a stranger. Noah had been at the top of the stairs when it happened. He had come out of his room for a glass of water, the same quiet errand he made several times a day, moving through the house on its margins without announcing himself. But when he reached the top of the staircase and looked down into the hallway below, something stopped him. Dominic was standing near the cabinet. Raymond was walking toward him from the kitchen. Noah sat down on the top step, pulled his knees to his chest, and watched. He was good at watching. He had been doing it for as long as he could remember, reading the space between what people said and what they meant, learning the language of posture and timing, and the small, controlled movements that people made when they were managing something. He watched Dominic hand Raymond the phone. He watched Raymond's face as he looked at the screen, the way the muscles around his jaw tightened, the way his eyes went still, in the manner of someone receiving information they didn't want. He watched Dominic's hands, loose and relaxed at his sides, the careful ease of someone for whom this was going exactly as planned. And then he watched Raymond turn and look toward the back of the house, toward where Celeste had been. Noah had seen this shape before the missing object. The convenient explanation, the way Dominic's expression shifted from concerned to reassuring, with the practiced timing of someone who had done it many times. He had watched it happen before, with the people who came before Celeste, until watching had become its own kind of weight. This time was different. This time, he wasn't going to watch it finish. He went back to his room and waited. He waited through dinner, through the sounds of the house winding down, through the particular settling quiet that meant the evening had ended. He waited until the hallway outside his door had been dark and silent, long enough that he was certain the only people still awake were the ones with reason to be. Then he got up. He carried the bear with him. He always carried the bear. That wasn't unusual. He moved quietly, which was also not unusual. He had always moved quietly. Celeste's room was at the far end of the guest corridor. Light showed under her door, faint the glow of a lamp turned low. He knocked twice, lightly. A pause. Then the door opened. She looked down at him without speaking. which was one of the things about her that was different. She didn't fill the space with words or crouch down and make her face very large and ask what was wrong. She just looked at him and waited for him to show her. He reached up and took her hand. She let him lead her. He took her down the back stairs, the ones the household staff used, narrower, carpeted, less likely to carry sound, and through the corridor that connected the main house to the east wing, Dominic's wing. At this hour, the windows were finally dark. He had been in this wing once before, briefly, through a door left open by accident. He had seen what was in the drawer beside the desk. The image had stayed with him the way important things stayed, fixed available waiting. He stopped outside the door, looked up at Celeste. She understood. She tried the handle unlocked and pushed it open slowly. A desk against the far wall, papers in organized stacks. The room of someone who treated every space as an extension of an office. Noah pointed at the drawer on the left side, the one with the small brass pull. She opened it. The clock was there. Lauren's clock nestled against the side of the drawer on a folded cloth. Beside it, a brown accordion folder, its flap secured with an elastic band. Celeste lifted the folder. She removed the elastic band, opened the flap, and looked at the first page for a long moment without moving. Noah watched her face. He had gotten good at reading faces. It was the primary language available to him. What moved across Celeste's expression in those seconds was not surprise. It was confirmation, the look of someone whose understanding has just caught up with what they already suspected, which is different from shock, because it carries the weight of everything that had to be true for this moment to be real. She leafed through several more pages. She looked at the clock. She looked at the folder again. Then she looked at him. He held her gaze. With her, it was getting easier. She had earned it in the slow, patient way trust gets earned by people who aren't trying to earn it. She closed the folder carefully, replaced the elastic band, and tucked it under her arm. She reached down and took his hand again, and they left the room exactly as they had found it. Door pulled to the same angle, drawer closed, nothing visibly disturbed. Outside, the east wing was dark and still. They walked back through the corridor, together, the bear under his arm, the folder under hers, and the house around them had no idea what had just changed inside it. She had the truth in her hands, but truth alone had never been enough to stop a man like Dominic Holt. The morning came in clean and ordinary, the way mornings sometimes did before everything changed. Light through the kitchen windows, the smell of coffee. The housekeeper, moving through the back hall with her usual, efficient quiet. Celeste had been up since before 6, moving through the routine of the household with the same steady composure she had maintained for the past 3 weeks, giving nothing away in her face or her pace or the way she greeted the staff. Whatever she had found the night before, whatever was now folded into the inner pocket of the bag she kept in her room the morning, did not know about it. She was carrying a tray of dishes from the dining room to the kitchen when she heard the bell at the front gate. She didn't stop moving. She set the tray on the counter and listened, the way she had learned to listen in this house. Not obviously, not with her whole body turned toward the sound, but with the particular stillness of someone cataloging what they hear while appearing to do something else. 2 voices at the door, male, official in register, not the tone of delivery drivers or visitors arriving for a meeting, but the flatter, more deliberate cadence of people who had come with a specific purpose and were identifying themselves. Raymond's voice then, lower, less certain. Then Dominic. Celeste set down the dish towel she was holding and walked to the hallway. The 2 officers, both in plainclothes badges, already visible, were standing just inside the front door. They were the kind of men who occupied space with professional neutrality, not aggressive, not warm, simply present in the way that people with official authority learned to be present. The older of the 2 had a document in his hand. He looked at Celeste when she appeared in the hallway with the practiced recognition of someone who had been shown a photograph in advance. "Ms. Morgan," he said. "Yes," she said. He identified himself and his colleague, named the department, and explained in the measured language of someone delivering information they had delivered many times before that there had been a formal complaint regarding property belonging to the household, specifically a valuable antique timepiece reported as unaccounted for following a review of the premises. He said that she was being asked to come in for formal questioning in connection with the matter. Celeste listened to all of it without interrupting. She kept her hands loose at her sides and her face composed and her breathing even, because she had learned in a former life that the moment you lost your composure in a formal proceeding was the moment you handed the other side something they could use. "I understand," she said when he had finished. She looked at Raymond. He was standing to the right of the officers, slightly behind them, in the position of a man who had answered the door, and then found himself in a situation that had moved faster than he'd anticipated. His expression was complicated, not closed, not resolved, somewhere in the uncertain middle ground of a man who had heard an accusation he did not entirely want to believe, and had not yet decided what to do with it. She held his gaze for a moment, not with desperation, not pleading, just steadily, the way you look at someone when you need them to see you clearly, and you are willing to wait for it. Raymond opened his mouth slightly. "Ray," Dominic's voice came from the left, where he had positioned himself near the entrance to the sitting room present, visible close enough to be part of the scene without appearing to direct it. He moved forward and placed one hand on Raymond's shoulder, the gesture of a concerned and steadying friend. "Let them do their job. This is how these things get sorted out properly." His voice was exactly right. Calm, reasonable, the voice of someone with Raymond's best interests clearly in mind. He didn't look at Celeste. He didn't need to. Raymond's mouth closed. The older officer produced a second document and explained the next steps in the same measured, procedural tone. The younger one moved to Celeste's left. She did not step back. She did not make any movement that could be read as resistance or as guilt, both of which she knew would be noted. She simply stood where she was and let the process arrive at her rather than moving toward it or away from it. When the restraints were applied, standard procedure, the officer said, for formal processing, she held her wrists out without being asked. The metal was cold. The click of it was a small, specific sound in the quiet hallway. She was walked toward the front door. At the threshold, she turned her head and looked back into the house. The hallway stretched behind her, the staircase at the far end, the cabinet midway along the wall, where an empty space still marked the absence of something that had always been there. Raymond was standing where she had last seen him, not moving. Dominic was beside him, his hand still on Raymond's shoulder, his expression arranged into something appropriately grave and concerned. She held the image for the 2 seconds available to her. Then the door opened and the morning air came in, and she was outside, on the front steps, and the house was behind her. She looked forward. The driveway, the gate at the end of it. An unmarked vehicle parked along the curb, exactly where such vehicles always parked. The door closed at her back, and then, from somewhere above, a sound. Small, deliberate. The sound of bare feet on marble stairs. Every head in the room turned at the same moment. It was the quality of the sound that did it, not loud, not urgent, but carrying a particular weight that silence sometimes gives to small things. One step, then another, slow and deliberate, descending with the unhurried patience of someone who had made a decision and was no longer afraid of what came next. The 2 officers had stopped moving. Raymond had turned from the door. Dominic, who had been guiding Raymond's attention forward, toward the driveway, toward the efficient conclusion of something he had spent days arranging, Dominic had gone still. At the top of the staircase stood Noah. He was in his pajamas, the ones with the faded stripes, the ones he'd worn so many mornings that they had become part of the ordinary texture of the house. He was barefoot, which was where the sound had come, from small bare feet on the cold marble of the upper landing. He had the bear tucked under his left arm, the way he always did, the way he had carried it for 4 years, and his right hand rested lightly on the banister. He was looking at Dominic. Not at his father. Not at Celeste, who had stopped on the front steps when the sound reached her and had turned slowly in the grip of the officer beside her. Not at the strangers in the hallway with their badges and their procedures and their careful official language. He was looking at Dominic, and his eyes had none of the distance or vacancy that people had spent 4 years interpreting as absence. He began to descend, one step at a time, no hurry. His gaze did not move from Dominic's face. "Noah?" Raymond's voice came out uncertain, not a command, not even quite a question. The voice of a man watching something he didn't have a category for, yet reaching instinctively for the usual tools and finding them inadequate. Noah didn't look at him. He kept descending. Dominic's expression had shifted into something that wore the shape of warmth. The fond, concerned look he deployed around the child, the one that communicated patience and affection to anyone watching. "Hey, buddy," he said in the careful tone he used. "Why don't you go back upstairs? The grown-ups are just handling something." Noah reached the bottom of the staircase. He walked across the hallway with the same slow, deliberate pace, past the officers, past Raymond, past the empty cabinet on the wall, until he was standing directly in front of Dominic. Close enough that Dominic would have had to step back to create distance between them, which he did not do, because stepping back was not something Dominic did in front of an audience. They stood there for a moment, the man and the boy. Dominic looked down. Noah looked up. And then Noah took the bear from under his arm. He held it in both hands for just a moment. The worn brown fur, the mismatched button eyes, the careful restitching along the back seam that had kept it intact through 4 years of being carried and held and slept beside. He had carried it since the night of the fire. He had carried it through the hospital and the new house and 1,000 mornings of silence, and everyone who had ever seen it had understood it as the thing a traumatized child clung to for comfort. They had all been looking at the wrong thing. He dropped it, not through dropped, released it from both hands with a clean, deliberate motion, and let it fall to the marble floor between himself and Dominic. The bear landed softly tilted onto its side, and something rolled out. It came through a gap in the back seam, the same seam that had been so carefully restitched and traveled 3 inches across the marble before coming to rest in the space between them. Small, brass-cased, the winding crown visible on the side, the crystal face catching the light from the hallway fixtures. A watch, not Lauren's clock, something older, smaller, personal. The kind of watch a man wore on his wrist. The kind of watch that could fall from a wrist in a hurry, in the dark, when a man was moving fast and had other things on his mind. Raymond made a sound that wasn't quite a word. One of the officers crouched down slowly. Dominic did not move. His eyes had dropped to the watch on the floor, and then come back up, and something behind his expression had shifted in the way that things shift when a door closes on a room that had seemed safe. His mouth was still arranged in its usual configuration, but the warmth had gone out of it, the way warmth goes out of a fire when the last of the fuel is gone, not extinguished dramatically, just no longer sustained. Everyone was looking at the watch, and in that moment, in the particular quality of stillness that had settled over the hallway, the held breath of it, the way every person present had stopped doing whatever they'd been doing and was simply waiting without knowing what they were waiting for, Noah spoke. His voice was small, a little rough the way voices are when they haven't been used, but it was clear, each word placed carefully, with the deliberate precision of someone who had been holding them for a very long time and was now setting them down exactly where they needed to go. His name is Dominic. A breath. He started the fire. Another breath steady. I saw his face. The hallway did not move. Raymond's hand came up slowly and pressed flat against the wall beside him, as though the wall were the only fixed point available. The older officer straightened from his crouch, the watch in a gloved hand, his eyes moving between the boy and the man the boy had just named. Dominic's mouth opened slightly, then closed, and the smile, the one he had maintained across 4 years of dinners and condolence calls and careful, patient management of everyone around him, the smile that had never once faltered in all that time. The room stopped breathing, and Dominic's smile, the one he had worn for 4 years, finally disappeared. The older officer's name was Detective Carver, and he had been doing this long enough to know the difference between a moment that looked true and a moment that was. What he had just watched a 7-year-old boy name a man in 3 sentences required careful handling. A child, trauma history, no prior verbal communication in years. The defense would call it coached. They would find their arguments. He knew all of this. He also knew how to read a room. He bagged the watch. He requested that no one leave the premises. Then he turned to Celeste. She had come back through the front door on her own, the officer who'd been escorting her stepping aside without being asked. She was composed in the way of someone who had been composed through worse, and when Detective Carver looked at her, she met his eyes without flinching. "I have documentation," she said. "I've had it for 4 years." She went upstairs and returned with the envelope. Lauren's envelope, the seal now broken, the contents organized with the methodical precision of a woman who had once done this for a living. She laid everything out on the hallway table in sequence. The financial records, first account transfers, internal memos, the pattern Lauren had documented with the thoroughness of someone who knew she might not be there to explain it herself. Then the handwritten pages, the names, the account numbers, the 2 underlined words at the bottom of the last page. Detective Carver read without speaking. His partner photographed each page. The watch went to the forensic unit by noon. By mid-afternoon, the prints on the casing confirmed what the documents had already suggested, a clear match. Combined with Noah's account and Lauren's records, it was the kind of convergence that left very little room for alternative interpretation. Dominic was taken in for formal questioning before the end of the day. He went the way he had always done. Everything controlled surface, composure intact. The manner of a man who had not yet decided which version of the story he was going to tell. But beneath that composure, for the first time in 4 years, there was nothing left to manage. By evening, the house had a different quality to it. Not lighter, not yet, but a pressure that had been present so long it had become part of the atmosphere was gone, leaving a stillness that was unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. Raymond sat in the kitchen after the last officer left. Celeste gave him space. She understood that what he was processing was not simple, not just the fact of what Dominic had done, but the architecture of it. The years of proximity, the grief they had shared, or that Raymond had believed they shared. The morning of the fire, the urgent meeting, the phone ringing in a parking structure, all of it rearranging itself now into a shape that had been there all along. The meeting had not been urgent. It had been manufactured. A reason to empty the house. A reason for Raymond to be somewhere else when it mattered most. When Celeste appeared in the kitchen doorway, he was already standing. "He arranged it," Raymond said. His voice was flat in the way voices go flat, when what's behind them is too large for ordinary register. The meeting, all of it. "Yes," Celeste said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he walked past her through the hallway to the staircase. Noah was sitting on the 3rd step from the bottom, not hiding, just waiting the way he always waited, patient and quiet, for the adults around him to finish with what they needed to finish. Raymond stopped at the bottom of the stairs. He stood there, looking up at his son, the small, serious face that had been turned away from him for 4 years, the eyes that had looked at everything except him for so long that Raymond had stopped expecting them to change. Then, without apparent decision, he lowered himself to his knees on the hardwood floor. The posture cost him something. It was visible in the way he held it. "I should have listened," he said. The words came out rough at the edges, the way things come out when they've been held too long. "I should have been there." Noah looked at his father, not past him, not at the wall or the floor or the middle distance that had been his default for 4 years. At him, directly, without the careful avoidance that Raymond had come to accept as permanent. The look lasted a long time. It did not contain everything. Some things took longer than an afternoon, and Noah was 7 years old, and the distance between them had been built across years that couldn't be crossed in a single moment on a staircase. But it contained something real, an acknowledgement, the recognition of a man kneeling on the floor in front of him as someone present, someone who had finally arrived at the right place, even if the road there had been longer than it should have been. Raymond stayed where he was. He didn't reach out. He didn't speak again. He simply remained on his knees on the hardwood floor, in the hallway of a house that was finally, slowly beginning to tell the truth about itself. And the wound, for the first time, was seen by the person who needed to see it most, which is always where healing begins. 3 weeks is not a long time to rebuild what 4 years had quietly taken apart. But it was long enough to notice the difference. Not in the dramatic way that change sometimes announces itself. No single morning where everything was suddenly different, no obvious before and after. It came the way good things often came after hard ones, in increments too small to measure individually, but visible when you stopped and looked at where you'd started. A degree of warmth here, a slightly different quality of silence there. The house the same and not the same, the way a room feels different when the window has been opened after a long winter. Noah spoke on a Tuesday, 3 days after everything had changed, for the second time in 4 years. It was a single word juice delivered to the housekeeper at breakfast with the matter-of-fact directness of a child who had simply decided that the word was needed and produced it. The housekeeper set the glass down carefully and said nothing about it, which was exactly right. And Noah drank his juice and went back to looking out the window as though nothing had happened. But something had happened. And the next day, there were 2 words. And the day after that, a short sentence, an observation about the weather delivered to no one in particular, landing in the kitchen like something that had been waiting a long time for permission to exist. By the end of the first week, he was speaking in the careful, measured way of someone relearning a skill they had once known, testing each word, before committing to it, moving slowly, but moving. Not every day was the same. Some mornings, he was quieter than others. And on those mornings, no one pushed, no one filled the space with encouragement or questions or the particular anxiety of adults who wanted things to move faster than they were moving. Raymond was learning that part. It did not come naturally to him. He was a man who had built his professional life on forward momentum, on the management of outcomes, on the understanding that problems responded to the application of sufficient resources and attention. Silence had always felt to him like something to be resolved. He was learning slowly, and with visible effort, that it could also be something to be kept company. Celeste watched him practice it. She watched him pull out a chair at the kitchen table and sit down instead of standing in the doorway. She watched him put his phone face down on the counter when Noah was in the room. She watched him look at his son, not with the assessing, helpless look of a man confronting a problem he couldn't fix, but with something quieter, something that was learning to wait. He was not perfect at it. Some evenings, he slipped back into the old register, the clipped efficiency, the premature conclusions, the habit of filling space with decisions. But he caught himself more often than not, and the catching was its own kind of progress. The invitation came on a Sunday afternoon, 2 weeks in. Raymond found Celeste in the library, a room she had rarely used, which perhaps was why he chose it, the neutral ground of a space that didn't belong to any particular version of the household's history. He stood in the doorway for a moment, in the way he sometimes stood in doorways now, without immediately filling the space with purpose. "I'd like you to stay," he said. She looked up from her book. "Not in the capacity you were hired for," he said. "That arrangement is finished, obviously. I mean," he paused in the way he paused now, when he was choosing words, rather than producing them. "I mean as someone who belongs here, if that's something you'd want." Celeste considered him for a moment. The offer was not simple, she understood that. Staying meant this house, this life, this particular and complicated future. It meant Noah, who was 7 years old and still finding his way back to language. It meant Raymond, who was learning to sit down and put his phone away and was imperfect at both. It meant a city and a chapter she had not planned on and could not have anticipated, standing in a parking structure 4 years ago, holding an envelope she wasn't ready to open. "Yes," she said. Raymond nodded, once the nod of a man who had not been certain of the answer and was not going to make a performance of receiving it. Then he left her to her book. The days that followed had a different rhythm, not structured around a role or a schedule, but around the ordinary navigation of 3 people figuring out how to share a space with intention. They ate dinner together most evenings, not formally, not with the careful arrangement of a household performing normalcy, but simply because the kitchen was where everyone ended up, and it seemed gradually like the right place to be. Noah sat between them. Not always, not by design, but often enough that it began to feel like a choice. He was making a position he had selected for reasons of his own that he had not yet put into words. On a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the day, the officers had come and gone and taken something dark out of the house with them. The 3 of them were sitting on the back porch after dinner. The Houston evening was doing what Houston evenings did in the better months, warm, without being heavy, the sky going through its colors at the western edge, with the unhurried ease of something that had done this a great many times and was in no rush. Noah was sitting between them on the porch steps, his elbows on his knees, looking out at the garden. He had been quiet for the last hour, which meant nothing in particular. Quiet was still his default, the place he returned to between words, and they had both learned not to read into it. Then he turned his head and looked at Celeste, then at Raymond. Then for the first time, not the careful, almost smile she had seen occasionally in the past weeks, not the small, involuntary expressions that crossed his face when something caught him off guard, but a real smile, unhurried and unguarded, the kind that belonged entirely to the person making it. He smiled. It lasted only a few seconds. Then he stood up, tucked the bear under his arm, and walked through the back door into the house with the same quiet self-possession he brought to everything. The door swung gently behind him. Celeste and Raymond sat on the porch steps in the warm evening air and said nothing for a moment. He had one more thing to say, but not yet. The afternoon light came in low and unhurried, the way it did in that final hour, before evening, turning the garden into something warmer than it had any right to be on an ordinary day. Noah had appeared at the kitchen door with his shoes already on, looked at Celeste, then at Raymond, and the question had been clear enough, without words. They had come outside together and settled into the 3 chairs that had been moved onto the garden path, slightly misaligned, the way chairs end up when people move them toward each other, rather than arranging them for appearance. The bear was in Noah's lap. He still carried it everywhere. Some things earned their place and kept it. For a while, no one spoke. The silence between them had a different quality now. Not the pressurized quiet of a house, holding something it couldn't say, but the comfortable stillness of people who had discovered, on the other side of needing to fill space, that the space itself was not a problem. Raymond sat with his forearms on his knees, looking at the garden looser than he used to be, less like a man enduring and more like a man resting. Celeste sat to Noah's left, her face tilted slightly toward the light, thinking about nothing in particular. The envelope was gone now, properly gone in the hands of the people who needed it doing the work Lauren had always intended it to do. The weight she had carried with it had lifted in the way weights lifted when they finally served their purpose. God had kept it safe through everything, through the moves and the losses and the long, uncertain years of carrying something she wasn't ready to open. He had made sure it arrived at the right place, at the right time, not when she was ready, but when it was needed. Noah reached out. He took Celeste's hand, first, her left hand resting on the arm of her chair, and held it with the deliberate care he brought to everything. Then he reached to his right and found Raymond's hand where it rested on his knee. Neither of them moved. He sat between them with both their hands in his, and there was something in the posture of it. The three of them connected the boy in the middle, holding both threads that didn't need words and didn't ask for any. Then Noah looked up, not at either of them, up at the sky, which had gone the particular blue that comes just before the color starts leaving for the evening. He looked at it with the serious, considering expression of someone checking something against a private standard. And then, in the careful, quiet voice that was becoming more natural to him every day, she would have liked her dad. The garden held the words for a moment. Raymond did not respond right away. He sat very still, with his son's hand in his, and looked at the same sky Noah was looking at. Something moved through his face, grief and gratitude together, the particular ache of a man receiving something he hadn't known to ask for, the knowledge offered freely by his son that the woman he had loved would have approved of the one who had come to help them find their way back. He tightened his hand around Noah's. That was all. No words. Some responses were too large for language, and Raymond Holt was learning finally to let the large things be large. Celeste looked up at the sky. She thought about Lauren, not with the complicated weight of 4 years, and everything left undone, but simply. A woman who had sat across from her in a coffee shop and trusted her with something precious. A woman who had loved a boy and a garden and a man who didn't always know how to show up and had tried in the only way available to her to make sure they would be all right. God had honored that. Even through the long silence, even through everything broken and delayed, he had kept a thread running through it all, and when the time came, pulled it taut. The afternoon light continued its slow work, indifferent to the particular significance of the moment it was illuminating. Noah held both their hands, and the house behind them, the one built to impress and had forgotten how to be warm, had finally, in the only way that mattered, become a home. Truth doesn't need permission to survive, and neither does love. Sometimes all it takes is one small voice finally feeling safe enough to speak. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone or something you've been carrying, take a moment and share it. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from today. Subscribe if you haven't already, because there are more stories coming. Stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Stories that remind us what we're capable of, even in the hardest seasons, because kindness is never wasted, and no voice, no matter how long it has been quiet, is ever truly gone.